Daniel Ji-hoon Kwan's fingers tightened around the crumpled $10 bill for the 10th time that hour. The neon sign above the diner flickered 3:15 a.m., casting jagged electric blue shadows across his weathered face. The sidewalk felt like ice. From his position in the darkened alleyway, he moved like a phantom, quiet, observant, and dangerous. In the dim streetlights, his movements looked jagged, suspicious. He glanced over his shoulder twice before tucking the bill deep into the lining of his worn jacket. His hands, though calloused from a lifetime of violence, were trembling. Daniel had built his reputation in the backstreets of Seoul on instinct, on smelling a lie before it was even spoken. He had suspected the woman in the blue scrubs from the moment she first stopped 3 days ago. Kaliyal, a Black American caregiver who looked as exhausted as the city itself. She's looking for a target, the voice of his old life whispered in his head. She sees a broken man and thinks he's easy prey for a scam. It made sense. Kaliyal was an outsider here, working double shifts in a hospital that barely acknowledged her existence, living in a neighborhood where the air was thick with desperation. She needed an out. Everyone in this city needed an out. But watching her kneel now, her polished shoes pressing into the damp pavement just inches from his hand, made something twist in Daniel's chest. He had wanted to be wrong. He had wanted to believe the world wasn't as dark as the shadows he'd lived in. Kaliyal didn't pull away. She reached out, her hand steady, and touched the edge of his sleeve. The forbidden gesture in a world where no one touches the invisible. This was the same woman the local thugs had warned him to ignore, the one who was supposed to be his enemy. Daniel leaned back, his calloused thumb brushing the scar on his wrist hidden beneath the sleeve. His pride sat heavy in his throat, a familiar weight. This was it. The moment he should push her away, vanish into the night, and remain a ghost. His muscles tensed to strike. But something in her unwavering gaze made him wait. The cold didn't just bite. It gnawed, a persistent teeth-on-bone ache that Daniel had learned to live with like a second skin. He adjusted his weight against the damp brick wall, his eyes never leaving the polished shoes of the woman kneeling before him. Kaliyal Loran didn't look like the other mercy givers, who occasionally frequented this block. They usually dropped coins from a safe distance, their faces twisted in a mask of performative grief, hurrying away before the stench of failure could cling to their expensive coats. But Kaliyal was different. She sat in the dirt with him, her blue scrubs stark against the gray grime of the alley. She held the $10 bill out, its surface wrinkled and worn, mirroring the exhaustion etched into the corners of her eyes. "You're shivering, Daniel," she said, her voice a steady anchor in the swirling mist. "It's not much, but it's enough for a hot meal and a bus ride to the shelter. Please." Daniel's jaw set. The name, Daniel, felt heavy and wrong coming from her. It was a name for a man who still had a soul to save, not a ghost who had buried his past under layers of filth and silence. He looked at the bill, then up at her. He saw the way her fingers trembled, not from fear of him, but from the bone-deep fatigue of a woman who had clearly spent the last 16 hours on her feet. "Lady," he rasped, the sound like dry leaves skittering over pavement. "You don't get it. Everyone walks away. The friends, the family, the men who swore they'd die for me. They're all gone. You're just a stranger with a badge and a soft heart. Save your money. You'll need it more than I do." He pushed her hand back, his touch surprisingly firm for a man who looked like he was starving. He felt the heat of her skin, real living heat, and it scorched him. "I'm not walking away," she repeated, her voice hardening with a stubbornness that caught him off guard. "Not tonight. I've seen enough people give up today, Daniel. I'm not letting you be one of them." "Why?" he scoffed, a bitter, jagged sound. "Because you think I'm a victim? Because you think I'm some poor old man who lost his way?" He leaned forward, the flickering neon light catching the dangerous, cold calculation in his eyes. A glimpse of the Mafia boss he once was. "I'm not who you think I am. There is no thank you coming. There is no redemption story here. Just take your money and go home before the city reminds you why you should have." He shoved the bill toward her one last time, his hand shaking with a mix of rage and a strange, buried protective instinct. He wanted her gone not because he hated her but because her presence was a mirror, and for the first time in years, Daniel Ji-hoon Kwon was forced to look at what he had become. The walk back to her apartment was a blur of exhaustion and the stinging memory of Daniel's cold, calculating eyes. Kaliyal pulled her thin cardigan tighter against the wind, her sneakers squelching against the rain-slicked pavement. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of the double shift settling into her joints like lead. She reached into her pocket, her fingers searching for the familiar crinkle of the $10 bill, only to find nothing but lint. A hollow laugh escaped her lips, vanishing into the hum of the passing night traffic. She had offered her last bit of survival to a man who looked at her with the suspicion of a wolf, and now she would be walking the remaining 3 miles home. When she finally reached the crumbling brick facade of her building, the flickering hallway light seemed to mock her. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs, her breath hitching in the silence. But as she approached door 4B, the air in her lungs froze. Taped squarely at eye level was a fluorescent orange sheet of paper, the ink bold and unforgiving. Final notice. Eviction proceedings to commence immediately. Kaliyal's hand trembled as she ripped the paper from the wood. The words blurred before her eyes. Outstanding balance, court dates, immediate possession. She leaned her forehead against the cool, peeling paint of the door, the paper crushing in her grip. This was the secret she had kept tucked away while she tended to the dying at the hospital. This was the fire nipping at her heels while she tried to play the savior on a street corner. She let herself in, the apartment dark and smelling of stale air. She didn't turn on the lights. She couldn't bear to see the half-packed boxes that had been sitting in the corner for weeks. She sat on the edge of her small bed, the silence of the room amplified by the realization of her own recklessness. She had spent $10 she didn't have to help a man who claimed to be a ghost. Everyone walks away, he had told her. As she stared at the orange notice in the moonlight, Kaliyal realized the irony. In a few days the city would make sure she walked away too. She had tried to hold back the tide of Daniel's cynicism with a single $10 bill, only to find herself drowning in the same sea. She thought of his face, the way the neon light had caught a scar she hadn't noticed before, and the way his voice sounded like someone who had once commanded a room rather than a sidewalk. She had seen a flicker of something in him, a spark of the man he used to be. But as she curled into a ball on her bed, clutching the eviction notice like a death warrant, she wondered if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She was a caregiver who could no longer care for herself, and the man she had tried to save was the only witness to her slow, silent disappearance. The following morning, the sun was a pale, sickly disk struggling to pierce the city's smog. Daniel had moved his station. He was no longer slumped against the brick. He was positioned half a block away, tucked behind a rusted dumpster that gave him a perfect line of sight to the entrance of Kaliyal's building. He moved with a practiced stillness, his breathing shallow, his eyes scanning the street with the predatory precision of a man who had once mapped entire territories from the back of a black sedan. He saw her emerge. She looked smaller today, her shoulders hunched as if trying to hide the orange weight of the eviction notice he knew was sitting in her bag. She began her walk to the bus stop, a 2-mile trek she shouldn't have been making. Daniel's eyes narrowed. He knew why she was walking. He felt the phantom weight of that $10 bill in his own pocket, a leaden reminder of the sacrifice he hadn't asked for. He trailed her from the shadows, a ghost following a girl. As she turned the corner onto 5th, a side street where the storefronts were boarded up and the streetlights remained broken, a silver sedan with tinted windows slowed to a crawl. 3 men stepped out. They weren't the polished soldiers Daniel used to command. These were bottom feeders, the kind who smelled weakness and mistook it for opportunity. They wore cheap tracksuits and expressions of practiced cruelty. "Hey, nurse," the tallest one called out, his voice echoing off the empty buildings. "We saw the sticker on your door. Moving out soon? We thought we'd help you lighten your load." Kaliyal didn't stop. She clutched her bag tighter, her knuckles white. "I don't have anything for you. Move aside." They circled her, blocking the sidewalk. One of them reached out, his fingers grazing the strap of her bag. "That's a nice bag. Looks like it's got a wallet in it. Maybe enough to pay back what you owe the neighborhood." From the darkness of a recessed doorway, Daniel felt a cold, familiar heat ignite in his veins. His jaw clenched, a muscle jumping in his scarred cheek. His hands, which had spent years in the dirt, curled into fists that remembered exactly how to break a man's spirit. He saw the terror in Kaliyal's eyes, the same unwavering gaze that had looked at him with kindness now wide with the realization that the city was finally fulfilling its promise to break her. He stepped out of the shadow just enough for the light to catch his silhouette. He didn't yell, he didn't need to. He simply watched, his posture shifting from the curve of a beggar to the lethal, upright spine of a boss. He was waiting for them to make the mistake of touching her. He was a man who had lost his empire, but as he watched the thugs close in, Daniel Jihoon Kwan realized he hadn't lost his instinct for war. He wasn't just a spectator anymore. He was the shadow watcher, and the predators were about to realize they weren't the only ones hunting in the gray light of dawn. The silver sedan sped away as Kaliyal vanished around the corner, leaving the street in a heavy, expectant silence. Daniel retreated back into the deeper gloom of the alley, his heart hammering a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't supposed to exist, yet the fire in his blood refused to cool. He turned to leave to find a new shadow to hide in, when the clicking of switchblades echoed against the brick walls behind him. 4 teenagers, barely 20 and fueled by the reckless arrogance of the low-level street soldier, blocked his path. They were the bottom of the food chain, looking for an easy score to prove their worth to whatever gang claimed this block. Old man, the one in the lead sneered, a jagged scar running through his eyebrow. You've been watching the nurse too closely. We think you've got something stashed in that rags of yours. Maybe that $10 bill we saw you fighting over last night. Daniel didn't move. He stood with his head slightly bowed, the picture of a defeated beggar. Go home, he said, his voice a low vibration that carried a weight the boys were too young to recognize. There is nothing for you here but regret. The leader laughed, stepping forward to shove Daniel against the dumpster. Regret? I'll show you regret. He swung a heavy, clumsy fist aimed at Daniel's jaw. In a heartbeat, the ghost vanished. Daniel didn't recoil, he flowed. With a grace that defied his tattered appearance, he stepped into the attacker's space. His hand shot out not in a punch but with 2 fingers extended, striking the precise nerve cluster beneath the boy's collarbone. The attacker's arm went instantly limp, the knife clattering to the pavement as his entire right side collapsed under a wave of neurological paralysis. Before the others could blink, Daniel pivoted. He seized the second boy's wrist, applying a sharp, agonizing pressure to a point on the inner forearm. The boy screamed, his knees hitting the concrete as his grip failed. Daniel stood in the center of the chaos, his eyes no longer clouded with the fog of the streets, but sharp and lethal. He gripped the third boy by the throat, his thumb pressing into a specific point on the carotid artery, a Mafia silence hold used by the gym gang enforcers to end a fight before it began. The boy's eyes went wide with terror as he felt the world begin to go dark. He saw the way Daniel looked at him, not with anger but with the cold, detached efficiency of a master. I have killed men far better than you for much less, Daniel whispered, the Korean accent of his former life cutting through the air like a blade. He released them and they scrambled backward, tripping over their own feet in their haste to escape the monster they had accidentally awakened. As they fled, Daniel looked down at his hands. They were still trembling but not from the cold. The dragon was stirring, and the secret he had spent years burying was now written in the bruised skin of the street. He had revealed himself to save her shadow and now there was no going back. The following evening, the rain had returned as a fine misty veil that clung to the asphalt like a shroud. Daniel sat in the same alcove, his back against the weeping brick, watching the street with a renewed, heavy alertness. He felt the weight of the previous day's violence in his knuckles, a dull ache that whispered of a man he had tried to kill off years ago. He was waiting for her, though his mind commanded him to vanish before she could look at him and see the monster beneath the rags. When Kaliyal appeared, she wasn't walking with the hurried, fearful pace of the other commuters. She moved toward his corner with a deliberate, weary grace. In her hands she carried a white plastic bag, the steam from within fogging the plastic. Don't go over there, Callie, a man from the corner bodega called out, his voice tinged with a mix of pity and warning. That one's turned. He nearly broke some kids' necks yesterday. He's gone off the deep end. Stay away from that crazy man. Kaliyal didn't even turn her head. She kept her eyes fixed on Daniel, her boots clicking rhythmically against the pavement until she reached the edge of his shadow. She knelt down, the dampness of the ground soaking into her scrubs, heedless of the filth. I heard what happened, she said softly, her voice remarkably steady despite the dark circles under her eyes. She pulled a warm container from the bag. Beef soup, the scent of garlic and ginger cutting through the city's metallic tang. The neighborhood is talking. They say you're dangerous. Daniel looked at the soup, then at her. He didn't reach for the food. They're right, he rasped. I told you to go home, Kaliyal. I told you I wasn't who you thought I was. Why are you still here? Because you're still here, she countered, pushing the container closer to his hands. And because I think you stood up for me this morning. I saw a shadow in that alleyway when those men stopped me. I felt someone watching over me. Daniel's gaze sharpened, the cold, lethal clarity of the boss flickering in his eyes before he suppressed it. You're imagining things. You're looking for a hero in a graveyard. Maybe, she whispered, her hand briefly brushing his calloused, dirty fingers as she set the spoon down. But you're the only person in this city who hasn't looked through me like I'm already gone. Even when you're trying to scare me away, you're staying. Everyone else talks about the danger, but they don't see the man shivering in the rain. She stayed there with him for a long moment, ignoring the stares of the passers-by and the whispered warnings from the bodega. In the silence between them, the once Mafia boss and the failing caregiver sat as equals, two people the world had decided were disposable. Daniel finally reached out, his hand trembling as he took the warm container. It was the first time in 3 years he had accepted a gift without a fight. He realized then that Kaliyal wasn't just a stranger with a soft heart. She was the only one who had the courage to look into the darkness and not walk away. The steam from the beef soup rose between them, a fragile curtain of warmth against the biting city chill. Daniel ate slowly, each spoonful a reminder of a life he had tried to forget, of ironclad loyalty and shared meals before the betrayal had turned his world to ash. Kaliyal sat beside him on the damp concrete, her knees drawn to her chest, looking not at the street, but at the flickering neon sign of the diner across the way. I'm losing my apartment, Daniel, she said, her voice so quiet it was nearly swallowed by the hiss of a passing bus. Daniel paused, the plastic spoon halfway to his lips. He didn't look at her, but his internal compass, honed by years of navigating the treacherous hierarchies of the soul underworld, shifted. He had seen that look before, on the faces of debtors, on the faces of those who had run out of time. The orange paper, Daniel rasped, the realization clicking into place like the chamber of a handgun. I saw you holding it yesterday. Kaliyal nodded, a bitter smile touching her lips. Final notice. I've worked 3 double shifts this week. But between the student loans and my mother's medical bills back home, it's never enough. I'm a caregiver, right? I spend my life making sure strangers don't die alone. But tonight, I don't even have the bus fare to get to the hospital tomorrow morning. She let out a shaky breath that misted in the air. I gave you my last $10 because I saw myself in you. An outsider. Someone the city decided didn't matter anymore. My family is thousands of miles away in Georgia, and here I'm just a badge and a pair of scrubs. If I disappear tomorrow, they'll just hire another girl to empty the bedpans. Daniel set the container down. The weight of her confession hit him harder than any physical blow. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the same profound isolation that had driven him into the shadows. He had been an outsider in his own world, a boss who could trust no one, eventually hunted by his own brothers until he fled across the ocean to become a ghost in a foreign land. She was an outsider by choice and by circumstance, a woman of healing lost in a city of stone. You gave me your last bit of hope, Daniel said, his voice dropping into a low, resonant tone that carried the ghost of his former authority. While you were drowning, you tried to pull me onto the ledge. I just didn't want to be the one who walked away, she whispered. Daniel reached into the hidden lining of his jacket, his fingers brushing the scar on his wrist. For the first time in 3 years, the cold didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like a call to arms. He realized that while he had been hiding from his past, Kaliyal had been fighting for her future with nothing but a soft heart and a $10 bill. The dragon inside him didn't just stir, it roared. He wasn't just a ghost anymore. He was a man with a debt to pay, and in his world, a debt to a savior was the only thing worth dying for. The following Tuesday, the city felt unusually quiet. A heavy stillness that tasted of iron and oncoming rain. Kaliyal stood inside her apartment, her back against the door, listening to the pounding that vibrated through the wood and into her very bones. It wasn't the polite knock of a neighbor or the official tap of a city marshal. It was the rhythmic, violent thud of a boot. "Open up, nurse," a voice snarled from the hallway, the same voice from the silver sedan. "The locks change tonight. We're here to help you pack whether you like it or not." Kaliyal looked at the cardboard boxes in the corner, her vision blurring. She had nowhere to go, no bus fare, and no one left to call. She felt the sudden, terrifying weight of the world finally closing in. She reached for the deadbolt, her hand shaking so violently she could barely grip the metal, ready to surrender to the inevitable. But then the pounding stopped. A sudden, sharp silence fell over the hallway, more chilling than the noise that had preceded it. Kaliyal held her breath, her ear pressed to the door. She heard a low, rhythmic sound, the slow, deliberate scuff of shoes on the grimy linoleum. "Move," a voice rasped. It was a voice she recognized, yet it was transformed. The dry, rattling wheeze of the homeless man was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant authority that cut through the air like a whetted blade. Outside, the three thugs looked at the man who had appeared at the end of the narrow corridor. Daniel wasn't huddling. He wasn't shivering. He stood with his feet shoulder-width apart, his chin tucked, and his hands resting loosely at his sides. The flickering hallway light hit the bridge of his nose, casting his eyes into deep, predatory shadow. The transformation was absolute. The curve of his spine had straightened into a steel rod, and the ghost of the street corner had been replaced by the lethal architecture of a man who had once commanded 1,000 soldiers. "You again," the tall one laughed, though his voice lacked its previous conviction. He pulled a lead pipe from his waistband. "You're a long way from your cardboard box, old man. Get lost before we break what's left of you." Daniel didn't blink. He took a single step forward, his shadow stretching long and dark across the peeling wallpaper. "This door is closed," he said, the Korean lilt in his English sharpening into a deadly edge. "And you are standing in a space that no longer belongs to you. Leave now and you might keep your hands. Stay and I will show you why the shadows in this city are afraid of me." Inside the room, Kaliyal froze, her hand still on the lock. She didn't recognize the man speaking, but for the first time in months, the crushing weight of fear was replaced by a strange, soaring sense of safety. The dragon had taken his post at her door, and he was no longer asking for permission to stay. The thugs didn't wait to find out if the man in the hallway was bluffing. There was something in Daniel's stance, the way his weight shifted with a predatory economy of motion, the way his eyes remained unervingly still, that bypassed their bravado and spoke directly to their survival instincts. They backed away, cursing and stumbling over their own feet, retreating into the stairwell until the heavy fire door slammed shut behind them. Daniel didn't move until the echoes of their footsteps faded into the ambient hum of the city. The lethal tension in his shoulders didn't dissipate, it merely sharpened. He turned away from Kaliyal's door, knowing he couldn't stay there. To protect her, he had to stop being a shield and start being a sword. He walked down the 3 flights of stairs, his stride long and purposeful, no longer the shuffling gait of a broken man. He headed toward the basement of the building, a labyrinth of rusted pipes and forgotten storage lockers. In the furthest corner, behind a loose brick he had loosened 3 years ago, lay a small oilcloth-wrapped bundle. With steady hands he unwrapped it. Inside was a heavy, outdated burner phone and a single gold signet ring engraved with a coiled dragon. He slid the ring onto his finger. It felt cold like a shackle and powered on the device. The screen's blue light illuminated the deep scars on his knuckles, a map of the life he had tried to bury. He dialed a number he had memorized in a different lifetime, a number that shouldn't have been active if the betrayal had been absolute. The line hissed with static for 4 long seconds before a voice answered, sharp and cautious. "Who is this?" the voice demanded in Korean. Daniel closed his eyes, the smell of the damp basement fading, replaced by the ghost scent of expensive tobacco and high-stakes power. When he spoke, his voice was no longer a rasp. It was the command of a king. "The dragon is awake," Daniel said, his words vibrating with a terrifying clarity. "And I need a favor." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by a silence so profound it felt like the entire city had stopped breathing. "Boss?" the voice whispered, trembling with a mix of awe and terror. We were told you were dead." "I was," Daniel replied, looking up at the ceiling, toward the room where a woman was currently clutching an eviction notice and praying for a miracle. But a stranger gave me $10 to come back to life. Tell the old guard to mobilize. I have a debt to pay and I want the city to feel the weight of it by dawn. He ended the call and crushed the phone under his heel. The ghost was gone. The dragon was hungry. And the men who had threatened Kaliyal were about to learn that some shadows are better left undisturbed. The dawn was a jagged line of gray light bleeding through the gaps in Kaliyal's blinds. She hadn't slept. She had spent the night sitting on her suitcase, listening to the creaks of the old building, waiting for the sound of the thugs returning or the marshal's final knock. When a low rhythmic thrumming began to vibrate through the floorboards, she assumed it was a moving truck coming to haul away the last of her life. She stood up, her legs stiff and trembling, and walked to the window. Her breath hitched. The street below, usually littered with rusted cars and overflowing trash bins, had been transformed. 4 pristine, obsidian-black sedans were lined up along the curb, their engines purring with a mechanical perfection that seemed alien to the neighborhood. The tinted glass reflected the morning light like polished armor. There was no shouting, no sirens, only a heavy, suffocating silence that commanded the entire block. Neighbors were peering from their windows, their faces pale behind the glass. The local gang members who usually loitered on the corner were gone, vanished as if the street itself had been purged. The door of the lead vehicle opened and a man stepped out. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than Kaliyal earned in a year, and his posture was as rigid as a soldier's. He didn't look at the building, he looked at the man standing on the sidewalk. Daniel. Kaliyal pressed her hands against the glass, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was him, but the transformation she had glimpsed in the hallway was now complete. He was dressed in a long, dark overcoat that masked his tattered clothes, his back straight, his head held with a quiet, terrifying grace. He wasn't a beggar, he was a monument. The man in the charcoal suit bowed, a deep, traditional bow of absolute subservience, and handed Daniel a phone. Daniel took it without a word, his gaze shifting upward. For a brief second, his eyes met Kaliyal's through the third-story window. There was no warmth in them, only the cold, hard clarity of a promise being kept. Kaliyal watched in a state of clinical shock as the men from the sedans fanned out, moving with a synchronized efficiency that made the hair on her arms stand up. They weren't there to hurt her. They stood like sentinels at the entrance of her building, turning the crumbling tenement into a fortress. She looked back at the eviction notice sitting on her nightstand, then down at the homeless man, who had just summoned an empire to her doorstep. She had given him $10 and a bowl of soup, and in return he had brought the world to a standstill. The city hadn't walked away from her, it had bowed. The air in the street grew thick, the kind of heavy, pressurized silence that precedes a lightning strike. The man in the charcoal suit, a high-ranking lieutenant named Jiro who had once bled for Daniel in the neon-lit alleys of Busan, took 3 measured steps forward. To the onlookers in the tenement, he was a figure of terrifying power, but as he reached Daniel, he collapsed to his knees, his forehead nearly touching the cracked, oil-stained pavement. Behind him, a dozen men in matching black attire followed suit, their synchronized movement a wave of dark silk and iron discipline. "The dragon has returned," Jiro's voice rang out, trembling with a devotion that the neighborhood had never witnessed. "We have held the line in the shadows, boss. We waited for the signal. Our lives are yours to command." Daniel stood amidst the kneeling men, his tattered jacket fluttering in the morning breeze like a battle-torn flag. He didn't tell them to rise. He didn't offer a smile. He simply stood with his hands behind his back, the authority radiating from him in cold, visible waves. From around the corner, the silver sedan drifted into view, the 3 thugs inside frozen like statues behind the glass. They had come back to finish their work, to throw a nurse into the gutter, but as they took in the scene, the obsidian cars, the kneeling army, and the homeless man standing at the center of it all, the blood drained from their faces. Daniel's gaze shifted toward the sedan. He didn't point, he didn't shout. He merely looked. Within seconds, Jiro's men were on them. They didn't use guns. They used the silent, terrifying efficiency of the old guard. The thugs were dragged from their car and forced onto the concrete, their bravado replaced by a primal, sobbing terror. They looked up at Daniel, their eyes wide with the realization of the fatal mistake they had made. They hadn't just harassed a nurse. They had threatened the only person in the world who had bothered to keep the dragon alive. "You thought she was alone," Daniel said, his voice a low melodic threat that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of their bones. You thought because she had no one to stand for her, she was nothing. He walked toward them, the kneeling soldiers parting like the Red Sea. He stopped inches from the leader's face, the gold dragon ring glinting in the pale sun. She is the mother figure of this house now. She is the conscience I thought I had buried. And you, he whispered, leaning down so only they could hear, are the debt I am about to collect. The thugs didn't beg for mercy. They knew better. In the presence of a boss who had been resurrected by a $10 act of grace, there was no mercy for those who preyed on the kind. Daniel looked back up at Kaliyal's window, his expression unreadable as his men began to clean the street. The debt was being paid and the city was finally learning who really owned the shadows. The black sedan glided to a halt in front of a glass and steel office building that felt far removed from the grime of the tenements. Daniel stepped out, his overcoat catching the wind, Jiro trailing a half-step behind him like a lethal shadow. They didn't use the intercom. The front desk security guard took one look at the cold, absolute stillness in Daniel's eyes and the ring on his finger, and simply stepped aside, his hand trembling as he held the elevator door. On the top floor, Marcus Vane, a man who built his fortune on the predatory collection of paper and souls, sat behind a mahogany desk. He was mid-sentence into a phone call about property values when his office door clicked open. He didn't look up immediately. I told you no interruptions, he snapped. I am not an interruption, Daniel said, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate the glass of the windows. I am a settlement. Vane looked up, his smug expression faltering as he met a gaze that belonged to a different world. A world of dark alleys and blood-sworn oaths. He looked at Daniel's tattered shoes, then at the gold dragon ring and finally at Jiro, who stood by the door with his arms crossed, a silent promise of violence. I don't know who you are, Vane stammered, reaching for his desk phone. But if this is about a debt, we deal in legalities, not. You repossessed a car and a home from a woman named Kaliyal Loran, Daniel interrupted, leaning over the desk. He didn't raise his voice, but the intensity in his tone made Vane pull back. You took her stability because she was $10 short of a world that cared. I am here to tell you that the debt has changed hands. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a stack of high-denomination bills, bound by a simple rubber band, and a set of transfer documents Jiro had prepared within the hour. He dropped them on the mahogany. The sound was heavy, final. The apartment is now hers. The car is returned to her driveway by noon. And the interest you've accrued on her misery. Daniel leaned closer, his eyes narrowing into two slivers of ice. Consider it paid by the fact that I am letting you walk out of this office today. Vane looked at the money, then at the documents and finally at the homeless man, who was dictating terms like a king. He realized in that moment that he wasn't dealing with a lawyer or a collector. He was dealing with Mafia diplomacy. There were no courts here, only the weight of a dragon's word. I'll have the titles cleared immediately, Vane whispered, his face pale. Do it now, Daniel commanded. He turned toward the window, looking out over the city he had once hidden from. He was no longer a ghost haunting the streets. He was the one making the city move to his rhythm. Kaliyal had tried to save him with $10, and in return, Daniel was tearing the world down to build her a foundation that would never shake again. He didn't wait for a thank you. He simply walked out, the dragon leaving a trail of terrified silence in his wake. The sun was beginning to set, painting the city in shades of bruised purple and gold, when Daniel returned to the tenement. He didn't wait in the shadows this time. He climbed the stairs with a heavy rhythmic grace and knocked on door 4B. When Kaliyal opened it, she didn't see the beggar or the monster. She saw a man who looked like he had carried the weight of the world for far too long. It's done, Daniel said, handing her a thick manila envelope. The apartment is yours. The car is downstairs. You won't be looking over your shoulder anymore. Kaliyal took the envelope, her fingers trembling as she looked at the titles cleared in her name. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. Who are you, Daniel? Truly. Daniel leaned against the doorframe, the gold dragon ring glinting in the dim hallway light. He looked away toward the narrow window at the end of the hall. I was a king once, he began, his voice dropping into a low melodic confession. In Seoul they called me the Iron Dragon. I sat at the head of a table where men's lives were decided with a nod of my head. I had millions, Kaliyal. I had power that could move mountains and silence enemies before they could breathe. He turned back to her, a bitter, hollow smile touching his lips. But power is a poison. My own brothers, men I had raised from the gutter, decided my crown was too heavy for a man with a conscience. They burned my life to the ground. They killed my family, my legacy, and left me for dead in a shipping container bound for this city. I became a ghost because a ghost is the only thing they can't kill twice. Kaliyal listened, her breath held as the homeless man she had fed soup to revealed the blood-soaked blueprint of his life. I hated this world, Daniel whispered, stepping closer. I hated the indifference, the cold, and the way everyone walked away when the light faded. I had accepted my fate as a pile of rags on a sidewalk. But then you knelt down. You had nothing, you were losing your own home, and yet you held out that $10 bill like it was a shield. You gave me the only thing my millions never could. You gave me a reason to remember I was human. He reached out, his calloused thumb brushing the edge of the envelope she held. That $10 meant more than every heist, every deal, and every gold bar I ever owned. It was the first honest thing I had touched in 30 years. You didn't walk away, Kaliyal. And because of that, the dragon woke up to make sure no one ever walks away from you again. Kaliyal reached out and covered his hand with hers. The silence in the hallway was no longer heavy with fear, but with the profound, quiet weight of two outsiders who had finally found home in the wreckage of their lives. Daniel Ji-hoon Kwon was a boss again, but this time his empire was built on a single act of grace. The neighborhood didn't wake up to sirens or the sounds of gunfire. It woke up to a silence so profound it felt like the city itself had finally caught its breath. By the time the first rays of sun hit the cracked pavement of 5th Street, the silver sedan was gone. The corner store wasn't surrounded by the usual huddle of predatory teenagers, and the boarded-up storefronts no longer felt like hiding places for the desperate. Daniel moved through the early morning fog like a cleaning wind. With Jiro and a dozen silent men behind him, he had spent the dark hours visiting the basements and backrooms where the local rot had taken hold. There was no need for a massacre. The mere sight of the gold dragon ring and the cold, absolute stillness of the man wearing it was enough to send the bottom feeders scurrying into the night. He didn't just scare them, he evicted them from the neighborhood, making it clear that this block was now under a different kind of sovereignty. As he walked past the bodega where the owner was tentatively opening his shutters, Daniel paused. He didn't look like a beggar anymore, but he didn't look like the Iron Dragon either. He looked like a man finishing a masterpiece. "Tell the others," Daniel said to the store owner, his voice a low, steady vibration. "The nurse walks this street in peace. Anyone who looks at her with anything but respect answers to me. And they won't like the answer." He spent the final hour of the dawn ensuring that the security cameras at the hospital where Kaliyal worked were upgraded, and that the local precinct's blind spots were suddenly illuminated by anonymous donations and well-placed pressure. He was building a wall of invisible protection around her, a parting gift for the woman who had seen the man behind the ghost. Standing at the edge of the park where he had once huddled under a thin jacket, Daniel looked back at the tenement building. He saw the light in Kaliyal's window flicker on. She was getting ready for another shift, another day of tending to the broken. She would walk to her car, and drive through a neighborhood that was finally as safe as the heart she carried within her. His work was done. He had cleared the thorns from her path and replaced them with a foundation of iron. He was the final protector, the silent guardian who had used the last of his old power to ensure that a world of indifference could never touch her again. As he turned to walk toward the waiting obsidian sedan, Daniel Ji-hoon Kwon felt a strange lightness in his chest. He had arrived in this city to die, but he was leaving it having finally learned how to live for someone else. He had been her shadow and now he would be her legacy. The transition was not marked by a return to the throne, but by the quiet laying down of a crown. Daniel Ji-hoon Kwon did not board a plane back to Seoul to reclaim his territory through blood. The dragon had found a different kind of fire to stoke. Instead of a syndicate built on fear and extortion, he used the vast liquidated remnants of his hidden wealth to purchase an old, sun-drenched colonial estate on the edge of the city. A place where the air was clean and the noise of the traffic was a distant memory. He stood on the wide mahogany porch, his back straight and his eyes clear, watching the transformation. This was the headquarters of the Kwanlaran Foundation, a sanctuary dedicated to the very people the city usually used until they broke. It was a place for caregivers to rest, for nurses to find the financial support they lacked, and for the invisible workers of the world to finally be seen. Kaliyal stepped out onto the porch beside him, no longer wearing the faded blue scrubs of an exhausted employee, but the sharp, confident blazer of a director. She looked out at the gardens where the first group of scholarship recipients was gathered. The orange eviction notices and the cold nights on the pavement felt like a lifetime ago, a dark prologue to the life they were building now. "You really aren't going back, are you?" she asked softly, her gaze lingering on the gold dragon ring he still wore, not as a symbol of power, but as a reminder of the debt he had paid. Daniel shook his head, a genuine, peaceful smile softening the scars on his face. "The Mafia is a world of ghosts, Kaliyal. I spent 30 years ruling a graveyard. I'd much rather spend my remaining time helping someone like you plant a garden." He turned to her, his voice resonant with a new kind of authority, one rooted in gratitude. "You were the only one who didn't walk away when I was nothing. Now we make sure no one else has to walk alone." Under Kaliyal's leadership, the foundation became a beacon, a new empire of kindness, that challenged the cold indifference of the city. Daniel remained in the background, a silent benefactor and a formidable protector, ensuring that the foundation's resources were never touched by the predatory forces of the underworld. He was no longer the Iron Dragon of the gym gang. He was the man who had been saved by a $10 bill and a bowl of soup. As the sun set over the estate, casting long golden shadows across the lawn, Daniel realized that he had finally found the one thing his millions could never buy, a legacy that would outlive the shadows. The dragon was at peace, and for the first time in his life he wasn't looking over his shoulder. He was looking forward. In the wake of Daniel Ji-hoon Kwan's resurrection and subsequent disappearance into the light, the city's underworld underwent a silent tectonic shift. The Gym Gang Syndicate in Seoul, once poised to erase Daniel's name from history, found their operations stymied by a series of untraceable surgical financial strikes. The dragon hadn't just left. He had pulled the structural supports from his old life and used them to buttress his new one. In the local neighborhood, the legend of the Ghost Boss became a cautionary tale for the small-time predators. The silver sedan was found abandoned at a scrapyard, and the thugs who had once terrorized Door 4B were never seen again. Some say they fled the state. Others believe they are still running from the shadow of a man who could turn a $10 bill into a death warrant.